pump that nasty track, rewind, play it back, sing low, shake it loose, feel the bass, pump that nasty.
A conflict of instincts by Roval of Foxfang. The sun shone high above the Alaskan tundra, gleaming across the bright snowy landscape around the town of Nome. Despite the town's small size, it was bustling with activity as people crowded the street in anticipation of seeing the winner of the sled dog race. That wasn't the only excitement going on, however, as two particular characters ventured into town, one more enthusiastically than the other. Boris was never keen on going into town. It was no place for a goose, and he always felt rather uneasy in the streets and snow-covered alleyways between the stoic wooden buildings. His companion, on the other hand, couldn't be more excited. While the two were content to live outside of town in an abandoned boat, part of Balto craved the attention of people and the other dogs. He may have been part wolf, but that made him nonetheless as friendly, if not more so, than the sled dogs he conversed with. "I am a country bird. I hate going into town," the goose complained with a flap of his wings. Still, he knew that the race always excited Balto, and he wanted to support him, so here he was as they continued. Though, Balto suddenly stopped, his nose in the air, sniffing curiously before padding off in a new direction. Boris grabbed onto his tail and slid across the snow akin to a musher behind a sled dog. "Now, where are you going?" Boris honked after Balto as they approached an open window. A low rumble from Balto's middle answered his question, though. The building ahead of them was the butcher's house, and it was clear that the smells inside were attractive to the wolf dog, who had skipped breakfast. Boris caught on immediately what Balto was up to, and he didn't like it. "No, I know what you're thinking, and we're not going in there." "Come on, Boris, what's the worst that could happen?" Balto smiled charmingly and ventured forward, getting his forepaws on the windowsill to see what he could eat. With a frustrated sigh, Boris flapped in, hoping to speed up the process so they could get out and on with their day. Unfortunately, he had picked a bad time, as the butcher just so happened to enter the room through a door at the same time. Their eyes met for a moment before the man grabbed a broom and swung it at the bird, the goose making an awkward honk as he flew across the room towards Balto. The wolf dog opened his mouth as if to say something, but got a mouthful of goose instead as Boris went beak first right into Balto's humid maw. It wasn't the first time he'd held Boris in his mouth like this. It was a convenient way to quickly carry him about while also muffling the snarky protests and criticisms the bird was fond of. The force at which the goose had been knocked into his jaws, however, brought Boris's beak past Balto's tongue and into his gullet. He felt the itch to swallow to clear his throat, and his stomach grumbled at the prospect of an early lunch. There wasn't much time to combat those urges as the human turned back around, glaring at the wolf dog. Adrenaline surged through his body as his muscles tensed, and without thinking he swallowed, once to pull his friend's long neck into his own throat, twice to get his round feather body firmly into his jaws, then a third time to swallow it all down with an audible gulp. Balto felt his throat strain as it squished the goose down into his body in the form of a significant bulge that settled in his belly. He didn't have long to comprehend what he just did as the butcher yelled in dismay and anger, "Give that back, you thief!" Balto managed to duck as a knife whirled through the air above his head, and despite the uncomfortable weight in his stomach, he leapt on out the window and back into the snow, narrowly dodging a cleaver that was aimed high and arced straight into the snow. The wolf dog dashed around the corner and leapt up a stack of boxes to the roof. He and Boris would be safe here, and it just so happened to be where he wanted to watch the race from. He breathed a sigh of relief and of satisfaction. He felt so pleasantly full, and the adrenaline hadn't quite worn off yet, but his delight started to fade as his mind began catching up with his gut. His smug smile turned into an uncomfortable frown as he slowly glanced down to his middle and tentatively poked it with a paw. "Ooh, Boris, are you doing all right in there?" What resulted was a flurry of unhappy movements, and a series of fortunately muffled exclamations and insults. The goose kicked out with his webbed feet, and tried flapping his wings in the tight space. The motions only made the subtlest of visible movements beneath Balto's thick belly fur. His stomach groaned as it reacted with some firm flexes that mushed the goose into a more manageable position. None of those struggles harmed Balto in any way. He'd swallowed live prey before in the form of some mice and rats that often caused problems on the boat, and while Boris was notably bigger, his stomach seemed to manage just fine. What did hurt Balto was the growing shame within him, his tail folding between his legs as he processed the two realizations that came to him. First, that he had accidentally swallowed his friend and father figure, and second was just how much he was enjoying it the whole time. Eventually Boris calmed down in his belly, either having tired himself out for the moment, or maybe knowing that Balto wouldn't hurt him. It was an accident after all, and Balto just needed to cough him back up. Only, Balto didn't know if he could, or if he wanted to. The feeling of live prey filling his belly, exciting his senses, was definitely part of his wolf side, or so Boris had said when he found out about the 3 rats he ate last week, and the instinctual pleasure the wolf dog was experiencing was only rivaled by his guilt at enjoying it. Part of him wanted to draw out those feelings, reasoning that Boris was fine in there at least for the moment. He wanted to relax, and enjoy his full stomach, maybe take a nap after such a large meal. He shook his head. That was his wolf side thinking. He knew he had to let Boris out soon, but here in the middle of town wouldn't do. He'd have to carry Boris back home. And what if someone saw him like that? What would they think of him if they knew he had swallowed his friend? Balto sighed, and hopped off the roof with his heavy belly swaying beneath him pleasantly. The sled race now forgotten, the thoughts in Balto's head were confused and conflicted between shame and pleasure as he padded distractedly down the alleyway, his belly gurgling happily as the bird inside continued his protests. Before long he was out of town and padding quickly across the tundra to the old boat. As he trotted he wondered just how long a goose could last in his belly. He stopped for a moment, considering trying to get Boris out then and there, but out in the open the cold would be a brutal change from his hot insides. No, he'd only feel comfortable releasing Boris at the boat, where there was shelter from the elements, and privacy for Balto's nerves. Boris by now had figured Balto wasn't able to hear him, and who could blame him? The goose could barely hear his own thoughts over the constant sounds of the wolf dog's body around him. It was too dark in the stomach to see, and all he could feel was Balto's firm fleshy walls squishing around him in a constant cycle of contractions that rubbed viscous fluids into his feathers and mushed him into a more compact position. The only way Boris had to tell which way was which inside the stomach was the constant sounds around him. Above him he could hear bones creaking as Balto moved, while below he could just make out the sound of crunching snow outside. The loud heartbeat and heavy breathing of the wolf dog was coming from the side of the stomach, where his webbed feet were, while the more subtle groans and gurgles ahead of his beak indicated where the rest of the wolf's digestive system lay, noisily processing yesterday's dinner. Boris wiggled each time the stomach flexed tightly around him, making him feel like he was briefly being crushed, and making him gag as more repulsive fluids drooled onto him, starting to pool around him as digestion started really going. Each second was worse than the last as Boris wondered if Balto was actually even going to let him out, or if he'd give in to his strong wolfish instincts. Balto, you need to let me out. Whether or not Balto heard him he wouldn't know as the wolf dog kept his pace, trying to ignore the increased activity in his belly. It felt so good feeling those struggles inside him, made him feel dominant like the apex predator he was meant to be. He arrived at the boat and hopped up the ramp leading to its cozy interior, a motion that was particularly unpleasant for his passenger being jostled around in his belly. He was now home, where he could safely vomit Boris back up, but his body seemed to disagree. He was feeling fatigued after such an exciting morning, and he did eat probably a bit too much. He wanted so badly to just relax after such a big meal, and enjoy those pleasant squirms until he dozed off. He knew that he couldn't though. That was Boris in there, The person he was closest to, and probably the only one that really understood him. With a low groan, his belly tensed as he tried to prompt it to release its hold on the bird, but Boris was awkwardly packed in there in such a way that it was difficult to fit him back into the throat he came in from. His round body proved more difficult to fit than his long narrow neck that had so easily slid down Balto's gullet. After a few tries, Balto thought he managed to make some progress, feeling his stomach lurch and force up at least something, but as the bulge quickly moved up his throat he could tell it wasn't Boris, and sure enough all that came out of his jaws was a loud belch and a cloud of soggy white feathers. "Come on stomach, work with me," Balto gagged, tasting the bile that Boris was stewing in. After the belch it became even tighter in there, and the goose was squirming constantly, not helping the situation. Balto pawed at his round belly, and tried pushing on it to get a better reaction, but after a few gags all he managed to retch up was more feathers, and more acids that stung his throat. Boris was still inside his stomach, and all the activity seemed to only make it worse. The wolf dog panted as he looked down at his belly, his body urging him to lie down and sleep off such a troublesome meal. After such exertion he was beginning to subconsciously agree, flopping to the wooden floor with a thump, and getting a low groan from his belly as it tried to resume digesting the goose. A whimper escaped his muzzle as he wondered what to do. "Balto, are you here?" A soft voice came from outside, a voice that he would have been excited to hear at any other time, but wanted to hear least of all voices right now. It was Jenna, the russet-coated husky padding in with a dainty gait and a curious muzzle. Balto stood up on his paws, lifting his belly up with a slosh. He tried to manage a smile, but it was clear to both canines that it wasn't the best of facades as the wolf dog's confidence was undermined by his shame and uncertainty. He tried to hide his bulging belly the best he could as he greeted her. "Jenna, what are you doing here? I noticed you weren't there at the race, and I figured something might have been wrong." The husky stepped in, glancing about the dull room of the old boat. Despite his bigger size, Balto seemed to shrink before her as his heart raced. Jenna of course noticed his demeanor, the feathers on the floor, and his poorly concealed swollen belly, and pushed further. "Is there something wrong? You don't look well." Balto glanced away with his ears folding back. He didn't want her to see him like this, with his belly full of goose, but he couldn't lie to her either. "Well, yes, I do sort of have a problem." He turned to show Jenna his belly, and for a moment she was confused until Boris made a few more weakened struggles. She took a step back, mouth partially agape, but she did not react any more dramatically than that, much to Balto's surprise and partial relief. She then padded over to him and placed a paw on his flank, feeling the goose squirming within. She didn't really know what to make of it, feeling a little embarrassed herself at her curiosity. "It was an accident. I tried to save him, but I can't get him back out." Jenna gently rubbed at his belly reassuringly before sitting down next to him to speak softly into his ear. "Let me help you. Maybe you just need a little push." She pushed him over onto his back, catching him off guard as she lay down perpendicular to him with both her paws on his belly. She felt the stomach rumble as the goose inside moved about, and pressed her paws in accordingly, stopping whatever Balto was about to say with a hiccup. Without a further word, Jenna pushed her paws firmly into Balto's belly, causing him to gag. At first Balto felt pain as she pressed into his gut, but as she continued he felt a wave of sickness go over him as the bulge in his middle started to move up out of his stomach. His belly growled as it squeezed around its meal, forcing it up under the pressure. He felt his throat bulge, Jenna getting off on him as he got to his forepaws to gape his jaws wide and unleash a slurry of stomach juices and a slime-coated, but fortunately still alive goose. Boris stood up, or at least tried to, as he immediately slipped and fell back down again, not quite accustomed to not being constantly caressed by strong stomach walls. Balto helped him up, although a little weak in stride himself, though flinched as the goose flapped out his wings, splattering gastric juices everywhere. "What's the worst that could happen?" he says. "What could possibly go wrong? It certainly took you long enough to spit me out." "Glad to have you back, Boris. I figured, since you hated being in town, that you might want to head back home." Balto managed a soft smile to Boris's raised eyebrow and sullen look. Despite the awkward situation, he was relieved to have his friend back on the right side of his belly. Eventually the goose rolled his eyes and started to march off towards the coast outside the boat, presumably to clean himself up. I'm too old to be treated like this. I'm a delicate bird, you know. It won't happen again, Boris, I promise. And with that, Balto and Jenna were alone in the boat, neither sure of how to respond to the situation. A gentle wind blew through the old boat as Balto tried to find words to rebuild his confidence around the husky. She naturally had to be the one to break the silence. Well, that's certainly not what I expected to be wrong when I didn't see you at the race today. I'm sorry you had to see that. I'm afraid of what you must think of me. Balto, it was clearly an accident, and in the end Boris is fine. Honestly, I'm impressed you actually got him down to begin with. Balto looked up at Jenna somewhat in surprise. He figured she'd be repulsed or wary of him, but she was just as friendly as ever. She giggled at his reaction and gave him a quick nuzzle. I'd like to see any of the other dogs in town manage that. You must show me how you do it sometime, though maybe with something other than close friends. Balto smiled an honest smile with his tail wagging behind him. He got to his paws and took a more confident stance, though his stomach interrupted with an unhappy rumble at being denied such a large meal. Well, there's plenty of rats around here, maybe you can stay for lunch, maybe chase some sticks by moonlight later. Balto grinned and led Jenna down further into the boat, both their tails wagging as he carefully sniffed out whatever rodents he could find so he could swallow them for Jenna to watch. Her curiosity made him feel better about himself, more accepted of who he was, and while he knew he'd have to apologize to Boris and get scolded later, he knew the goose understood him too, and so as he showed off swallowing the first rat, much to Jenna's amazement, he felt happy that at least his two friends accepted him for who he was.
That's all, Zipsters! Like and subscribe.